Story 1. I want to be able to make a bad decision or do something embarrassing and not be haunted by a viral video for the rest of my life. Edit. People are asking what embarrassing thing I did on camera that went viral. Sorry to disappoint you, but I am a lucky millennial who has mostly stayed out of the spotlight. In fact, with 2,000 upvotes and counting, you are currently looking at my most viral moment. Story 2. A custom 3-story home built on 20 acres of land. My mother stayed at home and worked the craft show circuit, and my father worked as a floor manager at a small local print shop. He earned $20 per hour. Story 3. A second child, also known as me. Raising one child in the 2020s is stupidly expensive. I cannot even fathom the cost of two. Story 4. My parents bought their first house in 1968 for the princely sum of £3,000, or £44,000 in 2024 money, about 51,000 United States dollars. My grandfather told them they would be in a lifetime of debt and that they were crazy. They sold it in 1986 and bought their second home for £27,500, or £79,000 in 2024 money, about 102,000 United States dollars. They have owned and paid off 2 houses, and their current house is worth over £250,000 now. They were not rich. It was something people on a regular income could do back then. For me to buy a house in 2024 in Florida would cost over 350,000 United States dollars, realistically over 400,000 United States dollars to have enough room, unless I can get a really good deal on a rural property and obtain a United States Department of Agriculture loan. I am approaching 50 and do not want to take on a 30-year mortgage at this point in my life. Story 5. My parents bought an entire 2-story house for about as much as the current 2-year tuition at the community college. They could make mistakes without having them videotaped and shared on social media for the purpose of cyberstalking and mob punishment. They could walk with family all the way to the gate, help with their bags, watch them board the plane, and see it take off from the concourse before leaving, instead of merely dropping them at the airport entrance. Story 6. A vacation to Disney World or any vacation. Story 7. Not a single thing. We ate things like hamburger helper and butter noodles, never traveled unless we were staying with family or sleeping in a tent, and got hand-me-down clothes for the kids. My mom would cut the shoulder pads out of suit coats once they were out of fashion instead of replacing them. I don't worry about money the way they did. I'm very appreciative of the suffering they endured to raise us, and I'm helping them as much as I can so they can live their best lives. Story 8. We were poor after the divorce. I swore I would never be poor again. With good luck and hard work, I made good on that. Story 9. I am better off than they were at that age. By no means am I well off, though. It is just one of the few perks of having parents from a poor country, I guess. Story 10. A home. It wasn't much, just a flat under a building's roof with only one bedroom for the 4 of us and no floor. But they could afford it. Later they did better. They had enough money to buy a cheap but large 3-bedroom apartment in a part of the city no one liked that is now very expensive. They bought a ruin to rebuild in the countryside that is now a lovely cottage and were able to pay for a few holidays here and there. Story 11. A house, a cottage, boats, all-terrain vehicles, sea-doo watercraft, ski-doo snowmobiles, new cars, groceries, and more. Story 12. I have time and money for hobbies. I am lucky enough to pay a bank to own a home, but a lot of my contemporaries are not. Story 13. We had a house, children, and 2 vehicles. We took family vacations and kept the house stocked with groceries. My mother was able to be a stay-at-home mom. None of that seems achievable anymore. Story 14. A brand new, unopened copy of Super Mario Bros. For Nintendo. Story 15. They did well. It cost about $65,000 and is worth $170,000 now. Story 16. We are considerably more secure financially than my parents were at my age, and until 5 years ago my husband's mother was as well. Everyone talks about older generations having it all, but we say very little about working-class poverty in their day and the repercussions of deindustrialization. Story 17. My parents were a doctor and an engineer. There were 4 kids in the house, and my dad had 3 from a previous marriage. There are a lot of things I could list, but the one that immediately comes to mind is when our nonviolent retriever bit a child. The child was asking for it, and my mother said we were going to get sued and did not want to put it on the homeowner's insurance. She said, "I'm just going to offer this child's mother $50,000 and hope she does not come after us for any real money." This was in the late 1990s. I am now in my late 30s. I make six figures and have no children. I would lose my mind if I had to give someone $50,000. Story 18. Pretty much nothing. They had 8 children and kept us fed, clothed, housed, and educated. That took time and money. Dad retired on disability at the same age I am now. I had no children, so my money went into retirement savings. Anything they could buy, I can buy 10 times over, but I do not. They taught me to manage my money and many other things. Story 19. A 3-story apartment in San Francisco with no formal education. Story 20. Raising 6 children, owning 3 cars, paying for their schooling, building a house, and taking yearly trips to visit family. Story 21. Nothing I can think of. My parents never owned a home in all their years. I owned 2 homes outright by age 35. Story 22. A second house? I haven't been able to afford the first, not even with debt and a mortgage. Story 23. My parents took us to the bargain bins at Kmart and to Goodwill, but they were still able to buy a house in a good neighborhood. The house was a disaster when we moved in, but I recently looked it up on Zillow and its estimated value is close to $750,000. It still looks run down in the photos. Story 24. My dad owned a house near the beach, a nice boat, and a decent business. I have children in college living at home and a 10-year-old car. A new car would be nice, but I can wait until my children move out. Story 25. Not much. I am drastically better off than my parents were at my age. Story 26. My parents bought their home in Silicon Valley for about $35,000 in the 1970s. That would be about $170,000 today, but it recently sold for $3,700,000. So even after adjusting for inflation, it would cost me 22 times as much to buy the house I grew up in as my parents paid for it. Granted, Silicon Valley is a particularly expensive place that became especially gentrified after the tech boom, but the extreme price change applies elsewhere too. I cannot buy a home anywhere in the entire western half of the country for $170,000. The best I can hope for is a mobile home. A permanent house that is not condemned and that comes with actual land costs a minimum of $300,000. Something as nice as what my parents owned back then would cost at least $700,000 in any area. Story 27. I am in a better financial place than they were or will ever be. I am really proud of the choices I have made and the habits I have unlearned. Story 28. An actual house. I finally put in an offer that was accepted on a condo after more than 2 years of looking. A house is completely out of the question. Story 29. I am significantly better off than my parents were at my age. The main reason is my parents. They had no support network, so when things got tough, they had no one to fall back on. My parents have made sure I have the support I need whenever things get hard. Story 30. A house, a cottage, 1 or 2 vacations each year, and children. Story 31. My parents could afford much less when they were my age than I can now. I'm grateful that I can spoil my mother a little. I wish my father were still around to enjoy it, too. They both worked hard so that my brother and I could have a good life. Story 32. I'm a baby boomer. By age 25, I had paid off or was very close to paying off my first house. There is no way my 25-year-old self could do that. Story 33. 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home in a pretty nice neighborhood. 2 children. The mother stayed at home. Story 34. My parents were 2 kids. They own 60 acres and a house. I have to budget so strictly that I use a tire tread calculator for my car, so I know when I need to buy new tires, laughing out loud. Story 35. Absolutely nothing. I am doing 100 times better financially than my boomer parents ever did. When I was a kid, we lived in poverty. I was lucky to get 1 meal a day, or 2 if school was in session because I had free lunches. Story 36. When my dad was my age, he was already married with a child and had been a homeowner for 4 years, with 2 cars. He could go on vacation every year and do whatever he wanted. Here I am, the same age, barely able to afford living on my own, and when I enjoy a few luxuries, someone tells me I shouldn't and that I must live in constant struggle. Story 37. My dad made $12 an hour as a Ford dealership service manager in 1992. I am making about double that when adjusted for inflation. I have a much nicer house than he did, and I achieved this on a single income. Also, fuck him. Story 38. A house, 2 cars, health insurance, dental insurance, home insurance, family vacations and retreats, food, braces for our kids. To be fair, I have some of these things, but only due to my mother's support. I'm scared for my future and my kids' futures. Story 39. Multiple properties, 2 to 3 children, yearly vacations, eating out several times a week, a healthy savings account, and saving enough for retirement. Story 40. Stay at almost any employer that hires you for 40 years and receive a good pension. Story 41. A wedding, building a brand new house, 3 children under the age of 4, and unlimited groceries. Story 42. Poor life choices. They paid for them in the end, and that stinks. Story 43. My parents died before they reached my age, but at 35 they had an 8-bedroom house, 3 cars, live-in help for 2 people, private school for the children, a horse, steaks, lobsters, original art, a grand piano, and travel money. Story 44. Probably not much, since it was only 5 years after Mao Zedong's death and the major reforms by Deng Xiaoping were just beginning. Keep in mind that post-secondary education was largely closed during Mao's rule, and China was very poor then. I doubt my parents, at age 21, could have afforded what I can now. Story 45. My father was 40 when he had me. I grew up very comfortable and spoiled as the youngest of 3. My mother was a stay-at-home mother and my father was successful. He owned multiple homes and a lot of property in India, where he had migrated from, and he supported all his siblings and extended family. I will turn 40 next year, and I currently have my firstborn on the way. Knowing that I will struggle to give him the upbringing I had sometimes gets to me. Story 46. My mother got a new minivan when she was my age, paid in cash by my stepfather. Because of the divorce, I can barely afford my bills. A new car, which I need because my car is more than 10 years old, is completely out of reach. Story 47. Others have a house, 2 cars, and 2 children. I live in an apartment with my girlfriend, and we both use public transport. We might have wanted children, but we are now about 5 years older than our parents were when they had their first children. Financially, we lag far behind. The world is in a bad state. Story 48. We did not graduate high school but bought a home, completed remodeling and extensions, had 3 children, owned 2 cars, kept a fully stocked deep freezer and kitchen, had lawn mowers, a washer and dryer, 3 televisions, a camper, and took a 2-week vacation off work without actually going anywhere because we were not big on traveling. Both were smokers, and we were not even middle class. Story 49. A house, groceries, a job, children, and rent. Everything you spend your life working for. They at least had a chance. We are just fucked. Story 50. A house, a car, 2 children, and all of that without any degree. Story 51. It is quite reversed. My family and I live much more comfortably and farther from the edge than either my parents or my wife's parents. I suspect it will be likewise for my children. Story 52. A house and 3 children, one of whom works and one of whom stays at home. Story 53. Financially, nothing really. I can see a house or travel being common goals for anyone in their early 30s or younger. I am in my mid-40s, so I managed to buy a house before the drastic post-pandemic price increases. Story 54. My partner and I both earn the median wage in the United Kingdom. My parents were self-employed and earned more than that at the time. I have much more financial freedom than they did. Story 55. A 4-bedroom house with a garage large enough for 3 vehicles, plus space to store a boat and a camper. They owned 4 vehicles: a truck, a van, a car, and a motorcycle. They took 3 to 4 vacations per year. They were middle-class baby boomers. Story 56. They had an apartment, a new car, and were raising children, but they were immigrants without any language skills. Story 57. They could afford a house, cars, motorbikes, a caravan, holidays, children, and contributions to a pension. Neither parent studied past high school. My father was a window fitter and my mother worked in a low-level civil service job. Both retired before age 60. I was definitely born at the wrong point in history. To be fair, things went badly in 2008 because mortgage payments increased dramatically. They managed to keep their house and have recovered well. Story 58. A house, 3 kids, 2 vehicles. Maybe they could even afford a fuck to give. Story 59. Enjoy yearly vacations and a recreational property with all the toys. Story 60. I looked up the cost of the house I grew up in when my parents bought it and its current price 20 years later. They could not afford it working the same jobs in this economy, no matter how hard they worked. The house is much older now and far more expensive than it was when it was newer. Also, costs for children, such as education, which was free for them, and medical treatments are much higher now. Story 61. It was the crisis caused by the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Story 62. They had a paid-off mortgage at 40, but they inherited far more than I did. Story 63. 10 days ago, I was exactly the age my mother was when she had me. When I was 5 years old, my parents bought a house. I do not see myself buying a house in 5 years. Story 64. Who has money? I do not, and I would like some. Story 65. They had a house and several cars. It also helped that they were a dual-income household and both had well-paying jobs. I earn a decent income, enough to be considered middle class in my region, but it still feels impossible to have even a fraction of what they can comfortably afford. Story 66. A beautiful house in a nice area, a Mercedes, trips to Florida in winter, a cabin in the mountains, groceries, nice clothes, and meals at restaurants. Story 67. A house and kids. But they also had to work harder than I do. I was taught to work smarter, not harder in many different ways. I'm pretty thankful for that. Mission accomplished. Story 68. At that time, currency was so worthless that people were paid in packs of cigarettes instead of money. Story 69. They owned 5 houses. 2 were beach houses rented during the summer. 1 was a house rented during the winter next to a ski resort. 1 was a 4-story townhouse where my mother lived full-time. 1 was a beach house that was not rented. Story 70. An apartment for a family of 4, a car, vacations, furniture, food, and life. Story 71. Not much. The country was much poorer back then, and they had half a dozen children to support. Story 72. I was about 10 years behind them but eventually managed to buy a home. They also owned a rental property and a ski condo in Colorado, both of which still feel out of reach. Story 73. To be fair, had we stayed in our first house, we could have retired early. Story 74. A house, 2 cars, and a vacation here and there, all from one parent working. I have a condo because I cannot afford a real house and a 20-year-old car. My career pays more, adjusted for inflation, than my father's earnings did. Story 75. When I hear about how older people became successful, I often think I will never be able to take those risks. With the costs of homeownership, fees, sales taxes, and education, it is hard to imagine how I could pivot or take those same kinds of risks. Story 76. A 2-story house in a middle-class suburb, as opposed to my 1-bedroom house in an exurb. Story 77. I am pretty sure that in their day they could win a house at a carnival. Story 78. A house in San Francisco with 2 young children and me on the way. Story 79. I have more possessions at age 21 than my parents ever had without their help. Story 80. A house, a life, nice things, healthy food, and medical care, even though they cannot afford them anymore. Living the American nightmare. Story 81. A house less than 80 years old. 2 cars less than 5 years old. A pickup truck. A motorcycle. A muscle car. Family summer road trips and camping. My mother worked part-time, and both parents had no post-secondary education. Both parents had 2 addictions. I have none. My wife has a university degree, and I work in the skilled trades. We cannot afford half of the things they provided, despite saving more money and acquiring education and skills. Story 82. My grandparents had a 6-bedroom house and were well off. My grandmother was a stay-at-home mother and my grandfather was a miner. I can only afford a 3-bedroom house. My parents were not so lucky. There was a serious drug problem here when they were teenagers and into their 30s. Thankfully, they steered clear of drugs, but many of their friends died. They got caught up in the fallout from that and did not start steady careers until their 30s. My siblings were not born then, but I have memories of my dad having to steal food for us and of him coming home on Fridays many times saying he had been laid off. My mum would take inventory of the food and money in the house to see how long we could last. Story 83. Drop us off at Grandma's house for the weekend and summer break. Story 84. My mom supported 2 children on welfare while she went to school. We lived in a 5-bedroom house, had cable and a phone line, and the kitchen always had food. She even smoked cigarettes. Story 85. A house is the low-hanging fruit, but I think my dad's ability to provide for the family from one job and enable my mom to be a full stay-at-home mom was certainly a luxury my wife and I cannot afford. Story 86. It sounds to me like local vacations and health spas were dirt cheap for them, especially sanatorium resorts. Story 87. Not a thing. I am fortunately much better off than my parents were. They lived paycheck to paycheck, had no savings, no life insurance, no health insurance, and no wills. My brothers and I helped them pay some bills. My wife and I took them on vacations and paid their way. When my father died, we worked with social services to get my mother on Medicaid. When she became ill, my mother came to live with my wife and me. For the most part, my siblings and I have done well. My son never had to be embarrassed that his bed did not have sheets or that his clothes were torn. He never had to lie and say he was not hungry because he could see there was not enough food for his younger siblings. Alcoholism is terrible, and people who are poor and have alcohol use disorder should not have 6 children if they cannot afford to care for them. Sorry for the rant. Regards. Story 88. A house, a car, children, all of that. Also a large amount of fresh groceries, which in today's world have increased by 50% and are labeled organic. Story 89. They paid to send me to college. My mother was 48 when I graduated, which is exactly how old I am now. I had no debt. They also paid for my car and living expenses and would not let me work during the school year. They had decent incomes, but not the high incomes of doctors, lawyers, or technology professionals. If I had children, I might have saved less for retirement and more for their college, but the cost now seems prohibitive for most people. Story 90. Not all parents had it better. Some of us grew up on welfare. I work now, so there is nothing my parents could afford that I cannot. Story 91. A new house was built overlooking a golf course. That was in 1948 in Minneapolis. I am in California now, and the median price for a new house here is $1.8 million. Story 92. A full life. A house, cars, vacations, children, one of whom was in college, investments, and expensive hobbies. I can maybe afford the down payment on a tiny condo. The rest will have to wait for my next life. Story 93. My parents bought more than 100 acres and had a house built on it. I cannot afford a small lot for a trailer or even lot rent in a mobile home park. Story 94. I feel guilty because many people my age are struggling, but I am in a better place than my parents ever were. They were not good with money, and that motivated me not to repeat their mistakes. Story 95. A house, 2 new cars, 3 children, and a yearly vacation. Estimated time of arrival. Daycare for all 3 children. Story 96. Just about everything, including failure, such as cars, homes, rent, and even opening businesses. Higher education is not necessary, or at least it should mean something. Story 97. Raising a large family on a public school educator's salary. Story 98. I am in a better state in life than my parents, who struggled financially. Story 99. My dad could afford a Corvette, but he was single and not yet a parent. Story 100. My parents had more than 50 acres, a house, a pool, 2 cars, and all the accessories on one income. My grandmother supplied most of it. They gave their children a hard time and years of therapy. Story 101. 3 children and a house. They worked harder than I did, though, so they have definitely earned it. Story 102. My mom was a daycare provider, and her month-long grocery bill for her family and the 10 children in her care was equivalent to my grocery bill for just my wife and me. Story 103. Relaxing. The world was less complicated, easier, etc. Now there's too much competition in every field. Story 104. I'm not quite that age yet. My parents retired at 55 and 57 and have been retired for 25 years. There is no chance I will retire at 55. I can work remotely, and I retired my wife at 44 when I was 46, so retiring is not as necessary for me. Story 105. The difference was that we were self-employed and they were government employees. We tripled their total annual income 4 years out of college. Story 106. The house I grew up in cost $70,000. It now costs over $400,000 and it is in a poor area. Story 107. I use a hand-me-down from my grandparents because there is no way I am paying $2,000 to $4,000 for a bed. Story 108. A nice 4-bedroom house in the neighborhood I grew up in is now out of reach. I am priced out of my old neighborhood despite both of us having good jobs. My parents could have afforded that house and still paid for vacations, shopping, the nicer grocery store with name brand products, and extracurricular activities. We had to buy in a cheaper neighborhood to get the house we wanted, so we do not have as much left over for fun things now. Story 109. My mother was very bad at managing money. She used my social security number to open lines of credit. My father was better with money, but he was in the military and did not make much until he became an officer. I surpassed both my parents by the time I reached their ages a long time ago. This is not to brag. I am proud of myself. Story 110. College tuition for 3 children. A 4-bedroom house on an acre in a high cost of living area, and fancy vacations. My parents were and remain fairly well off. Story 111. I would have a home, and if I were married, I would be there as well. Inflation is real, but more wealth is held by retired people now. It can be hard to be optimistic sometimes, but it is worth saving an extra $10 a week if you can manage it. I truly believe that if you follow a budget and are willing to try, we will all get there eventually, assuming we are not literally starving. Story 112. My dad drove a school bus and was able to buy 2 houses before I was 10. Story 113. My parents had a home and 3 children. Although my father was laid off for a time when we were children, they were able to survive on a single income. They worked hard for what they have, but it is impossible for me to hold a similar job and thrive in my hometown in 2024. Story 114. Even renting a house, I cannot afford it the way they could. Story 115. My parents could afford a house. It was tiny, under 1,000 square feet, very old, and needed many repairs. Over the years they worked on it and made it livable. When they had the means, they sold that house and bought a slightly larger, better one. Today many young people, including my children, do not want a starter house. They want the house their parents moved into after upgrading. Maybe it is a sense of entitlement, maybe not. I do think it contributes to the housing problem. Story 116. A nice cabin on the very border of one of the national parks in the United States. Story 117. My parents, one a school teacher and the other a custodian, bought their first house in 1978 for $37,500 using a $5,000 loan from my great-grandparents for the down payment. They sold that house in 1985 for $185,000 and bought a house in the suburbs for $225,000. Interest rates fell sharply in the early 1990s, and they refinanced their 30-year mortgage to a 15-year mortgage while still lowering their monthly payment. In the mid-1990s, they sold that house for a small profit and bought another for $425,000. Today that house is worth about $1.5 million. So, in their 40s, they turned a $5,000 loan into a $1.5 million asset. Story 118. A nice 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house with 2 cars, a recreational vehicle for summer camping, and 2 children. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.